Thank you, Brian. All right, quick review. 1 Samuel chapter 16 was with Pastor Cal. And then that opened up with Samuel in mourning for Saul, which was interesting because if we think back, Samuel had been told that the people wanted a king. He was told that he was too old. He was told about they wanted to be like all the other nations. And God had eventually said he was going to give Israel a king. And at that point, Samuel was upset. And think of all the times in between then and where we're getting ready to go in chapter 18 that Saul messed up. He had been called out by Samuel. But we're still told in 16 that Samuel mourned. So Samuel was able to pursue God's will with regard to leadership, not his own. And Samuel was told by God to anoint a person who God would make known to him. And then again, we saw the human side of Samuel. We were told that he was afraid. Samuel had to travel when he went to find David. He had to travel through where Saul was, and basically his reaction was very human. It was pretty much, man, if Saul finds out, I'm toast, right? So here's the priest who is still that human aspect of him. I'm toast. And God in his mercy had a plan. And then that plan came in the form of what? Sacrifice. Just the details are just amazing, right? Because God did have a plan for sacrifice further down the road, but this is just a reflection of that. So years later, there would be a perfect sacrifice, but at that moment, God's plan to keep Samuel out of hot water with Saul was a sacrifice. And what an implication that would be down the road. Pastor Cal pointed out that we can read from a distance and say, well, Samuel of all people, a priest, should have known God had a plan, right? Yet the fear of Samuel is no different than the fear we have at times today. So I thought that was a very poignant application. And whether we face employment issues, health struggles, marriage problems with our children, we fill in our crisis, God has a plan. He had a plan then, he has a plan now, and he has a plan into the future. It's the same God. It's the same God then, the same God now, the same God into eternity. So Samuel makes it safely to Jesse and all of Jesse's sons, but one is there. David's out with the sheep. And David wasn't even a blip on the radar, if you recall, right? Except for God's radar. And saw that even Samuel looked up to the sons as a man would. He saw the first one. He's like, oh, that's got to be the one. Of course that's the one, but it wasn't. Samuel, again, was looking at outward appearances just like man would, and we understand that God doesn't look at the outward appearances. God looks at the heart. And application there, man's standards are always lower than God's. Even the priest standards were lower. So there ends up being a public anointing for David versus a private anointing of Saul. And we're told at some point that the Spirit of God left Saul. And the remaining rule of Saul from then and even into what we're going to talk about today and further on is the rule of just a man. And all the problems that he would face, they weren't problems because of his troubled emotional state or the trouble because of his upbringing or anything like that. It was because God had left him. Outwardly, he's being attacked, but inwardly, the Spirit of God has departed. And then we saw that the sovereignty of God in the music, as we wrapped up chapter 16, the sovereignty of God in music. What do you know? Saul had an issue, and music could solve it. And oh, by the way, here's David, and he's pretty good with a harp. So again, God's sovereignty. David was a musician. As we moved into chapter 17 with Tom had us looking at a deeper meaning. So we were talking about David and Goliath, and Tom reminded us to go deeper into that, right? The people of Gath were a remnant of those people who Israel had failed to drive out, and part of that resulted in their being in the 40 years wandering in the desert. And then eventually when they meet again, here they are later, David defeats Goliath, digging deeper than just fighting your battles or standing up against forces bigger than you. Tom brought out that it's actually a picture of the curse of man ultimately being defeated by Christ, as we're told in Genesis 3. We learned that Goliath was about 9 feet tall, and that the biggest guy that Israel had was Saul. And where was Saul? As he always is, somewhere else, right? Some type of position, hiding or doing whatever, in the back with the gear. And Tom reminded us also, as he often does, pay attention to what we didn't see. At that point, we didn't see any prayers from Saul. We didn't see requests for the priests from Saul. Matter of fact, Saul had 40 days to do something, and he didn't do anything. He just waited, and he was basically afraid, just like all the other people. But Saul was the king, right? He should have been a leader, and he definitely wasn't. And at that point, all the positive things we know about Jonathan, there's a difference between Jonathan and Saul. Even at this point, Jonathan apparently was afraid. So Jesse has 3 boys fighting, 4 at home. Of those 4, David was one of them, and he was in the field. But we also learned that he wasn't just in the field. That was a sovereignty of God preparing him for this moment in a way that right off the bat one wouldn't expect. Right? So he was picked by God to run that errand. And David, of all people, would have been the least likely to fight a giant. Once David was told to go find his brothers in a dangerous place, we didn't see any hesitation in him. Right? All of Israel said, the word says, all of Israel was afraid because of Goliath. But David understood this was about God, not the army of man. David knew he'd been anointed, and he may have been the least, but he knew he'd been chosen. And all those mundane tasks were actually preparation for his ability. It wasn't, well, as luck would have it, he's good with the harp and he's good with the slingshot. That wasn't the case. And Tom again reminded us we serve that same God. He doesn't change. We too are prepared in our task, no matter how mundane we may find them. That is actually God preparing us for future events where we're to bring him glory. And Tom asked us, do we put our trials into action for the glory of God? And David, as we wrap up 17, David saw Goliath as any other beast that he had faced. And in the end, the glory of God would topple Goliath just like the ark toppled Dagon. When they were put beside it, the ark didn't do it, the Spirit of God did it, but as they put the ark next to Dagon. So 17 was not about faith like a giant. It was about Christ and David as the precursor of Christ crushing death. We move now into 18. 18 is very interesting from my perspective because it sits in the middle of you have David and Goliath, one of the best known stories of David and Saul. And then in 19 we have David and Jonathan with the arrows, very, very, well known. And 18 is kind of in the middle. It's very interesting. For me to get a lot of the meaning out of 18, I had to go back and forth to different chapters. There's so many things that subtly, if you just skim through 18, you miss, but then you're like, wait a minute, there was something about that back and forth. So we're going to do a lot of that today. I'm not going to ask you to flip back. I'll kind of point you to it and remind you to it. But there are things that we know and we're going to learn about David based upon what we've been told in previous chapters. He was a good musician. He was a man of valor. He was a warrior. The word says he had understanding in speech. He was of fine form. But the thing we hear the most repetitive about David is the Lord was with him. We're actually going to hear that 3 times in 18. The Lord was with him. And as we know, if it's repeated, it's important because it's in God's word. If it's repeated, it's really important. And now it's repeated 3 times just in this chapter. So we're not personally told of any military training that David specifically got growing up. But we are told of his courage. We know of, and we were told of his skill when he faced wild animals, but we weren't told of any other medical ability or anything like that. We were told he had a good way with words, but over and over, the power of God was in his life. And as the story of 18 unfolds, it's an awkward time within the kingdom, right? So Israel is like, it's the first king. They're still new to dealing with that. And Saul is still king, but we're in this position where David has been anointed. And Saul was the first king, so it's not like they could go back in history and go, well, this is how we did it with such and such. Right? This is all the first time for them. They don't have the past to guide them with regard to a king. They have the past to remind them with the word and their failures and their accomplishments. But as we know with Israel, a lot of times they don't draw too well from their past. We have to stop and pause there and say, what about us? Are we able to do that with our past? Learn from it, move on, grow from it. But I was thinking as I was studying this, like, you know, to some degree, they're in a position kind of like we are now. We just elected a governor, so we have a new governor, but we still have a governor. And there's this awkward thing. If you know anything about state politics, this is a very awkward time because we have that thing called the transition. And we spent a lot of time making this one person feel very important. And that person is still kind of important, but now we got a new boss in the waiting, and we really want to make that boss know how good we are. So in state government, we're in that awkward time, much like Israel was to some degree. Israel's a little bit different because they had the element of the Spirit of God, and that had been taken from Saul, and we know he doesn't react good to that. Saul was rejected, David was anointed, and their kingdoms, as we move into 18 and further in 1 Samuel, we're going to see a collision of those two kingdoms as it just rolls downhill like a avalanche or a snowball as it grows. And again, in my mind, I'm trying to picture, like, what is this like? How many people here like to watch the sun set at night? Certain people really like that. How many people like to watch the sun rise in the morning? There's some people, we know Pastor Mark and Miss Kathy love to do that. Imagine, if you will, in my mind, it's like watching the sunset. Oh, this is great. And at the same time, the sun rise and you're caught in this middle and you're like, man, I don't know what's going on here. It's interesting, but I'm uncomfortable with this. And this is kind of what Israel must have been going through with these two leaders. The sun is rising on David. And we previously read in chapter 16 that Saul loved him. We read the people loved David. We're going to read that Saul's son loves David. We're going to read that Saul's daughter loved David. We have read and we will read that Saul's attendants love David, yet Saul hates him. It's very, very awkward, very unsettling. And for somebody who struggles with acceptance like Saul does, to be liked, that's what Saul has been after this whole time. This would have been very difficult, right? All the people close and important to him have these feelings, these positive feelings towards this one person, and it's taking away from him. I always looked at Saul as like, he's an angry dude. Really, Saul was a hurting dude, right? And all these people that he wants his attention from, whether it's the public or his own relatives, they have these feelings towards this person, and he has the exact opposite.
The other thing, Alan, is we're never told in Scripture that the evil spirit departed from Saul. We're only told that when David played, it soothed him.
Right.
We're never told that it left him.
Right.
So he's one that's tormented all the time at this point.
That's a good word. I mean, that's not a good word, but I like that the use of it, torment. It's accurate. Tormented. So if you can put yourself in his position of this expression, right? All these people have these positive things. It had to eat and gnaw at him, and he couldn't let it out because they loved David so much. If he let it out, they were going to like him even less. And he's a person that struggles with being liked and being accepted. If you're that type of person, you need to be liked, but you hate the dude that they like. And this type of hate fuels itself like some wildfire out west. So that's kind of the lead up to as we roll into 18. If somebody would please read verses 1 through 16 in chapter 8 for us.
Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David and his armor, even his sword and his bow and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. And this was good in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom?" And Saul eyed David from that day on. The next day a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre, as he did day by day. Saul had a spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, "I will pin David to the wall." But David evaded him twice. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So Saul removed him from his presence and made him a commander of 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David had success in all his undertakings, for the Lord was with him. And when Saul saw that he had great success, he stood in fearful awe of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, for he went out and came in before them.
Thank you. So we start off in verse 1. Now it happened when they had finished speaking to Saul, that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. To figure that out a little bit more detail, we have to look back to that conversation. And if we look back to that conversation in 17:55 through 58, it said, previous chapter, "Now when Saul saw David going out to meet the Philistines, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, 'Abner, whose son is this young man?' And Abner said, 'By your life, O king, I do not know.' And the king said, 'You inquire whose son the youth is.' So when David returned from striking down the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the Philistine's head in his hand. And Saul said to him, 'Whose son are you, young man?' And David answered, 'I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite.'" A lot of times this is mistaken when we read this to Saul saying, "Hey, who is that dude?" Pointing to David. Like, who is that? We kind of glance over it and we think that's what he's saying, but that's not what he's saying. But it can be confusing. And it's wrong because we know that Saul and David had a relationship prior to this. They already had interaction with one another. What Saul is actually asking Abner is, who's his dad? Like, who's his people? That's what we would say today. Hey, who's your people, right? And in small towns, we have a better understanding of that than we do in larger towns, because that speaks something in a small town environment. When you know these person's relatives, you know their parents and their grandparents, it tells you something, good or bad, about the person you're inquiring of. And it indicated in 17 that Abner didn't know, and Saul told him to go find out. It gives us a glimpse into the previous interactions, though, that they weren't really that deep for Saul to know David's story or to care about it. And this is significant. It shows us how superficial Saul really was. Because in 16, right, Saul, as Pastor Cal pointed out, Saul's vexed with this spirit, right? His servants tell him about this son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who was a skillful musician. Asked and answered, we say in police work. But Saul sends messengers to Jesse saying, "Hey, send me your son who's in the flock." There's some degree, now maybe he didn't know, he just sent them, and the messengers knew, but there was some understanding of who the family was. David stands before Saul. Saul found pleasure in him, and he actually became an armor bearer, and we were told that Saul loved him. And Saul communicated back to Jesse, let David stay because he's found favor, right? And that's how David became Saul's musician. And then in 57, as soon as David gets back from taking out Goliath in the previous chapter, Abner's on the case, right? David is before Saul with Goliath's head in his hand. And he's saying, whose boy are you? David, he's respectful. He's detailed with his response, right? But Saul had been told all of this in some fashion. He should have known all of this. We don't get that in this chapter. We get a boom. Find out whose son it is. They're standing there, and he tells them whose son he is, and then all of a sudden, there's a lot that we don't know there. Because all he says, according to what we have in the Word, all we're told that he says, right, is whose son he is, and then it says, as soon as that happened, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. So there had to be more than that. It had to be. It couldn't be somebody asking me, or John Anderson says, hey, who's your dad? And I say, Howard Chambers, and I'm from the other end of the coast, and John Anderson grew up in Amelia, and all of a sudden John wants to be my best friend. It's more than that relationship, but that's kind of what we get here. We have to understand there was more to that conversation.
Well, couldn't Jonathan have been right there? I mean,
The commentators say he was there and he heard all of that, but we don't know what that is my point of all we're told is in this section, he tells him who his dad is, and Jonathan's soul is knit to him. So my point there is there's a lot of things that we don't know what happened in that conversation. It had to be a conversation. Commentators would say, I agree, there had to be a lot of God talk in that conversation, right? For Jonathan's soul to automatically feel that disposition. There had to be more to the conversation. We're not told, but you can't get that type of affection. You can't get that kind of relationship just from telling somebody who your dad is. Especially the relationship with the regard of Jonathan's perspective, because we have to remember Jonathan's dad is the king. What does Jonathan care who David's dad is, right? My dad's the king. Nobody is important. Nobody is more important than Jonathan's dad. So it wouldn't have been, oh, your dad is such and such? Oh, yeah, I want to align. It's not. You follow Yahweh, I saw you in action, and maybe some more conversation, more likely. Now, we know that lineage was more important back then than it is today, so it would make some sense that you could be impressed, right? And we just have that great feat that David had accomplished. But they had already been in proximity. David had already been in proximity with the king. And we can't help but wonder, why does Saul's interest peak now at this point of the story, right? Why is he trying to find out now who his son is this person? He had a great victory, but Saul had plenty of time. 40 days, he was just hanging out, dodging Goliath, so to speak. And we have to remember back to what Brian taught in chapter 15, specifically in verse 28, right? When Saul didn't kill the people in the manner in which he was supposed to, Samuel confronted him, and he turned to leave. Saul grabs his garment, and the robe tore. In verse 28, it says, Samuel said to him, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to one of your neighbors, to one better than you. And typically, even when I read that, the better than you stuck out to me. I missed the Sunday when Brian taught that. I don't know if he brought this up or not, but when I was listening to a lot of commentators, when they brought that verse up, they would repeat it as if they were in Saul's head, and they would say, Saul probably heard better than you, better than you, better than you. Probably heard that his whole life, right? But the thing at least I tend to skip over was, has given it to one of your neighbors. And so could that have been Saul sees this big defeat, and now all of a sudden Saul's thinking, whose dad is he in relation to where I am? And is this the lineage from one of my neighbors who's better than me? We can't help but wonder, is Saul trying to put two and two together here at this point? Because he knows his kingdom has been taken from him. It just hasn't come to fruition yet. And as we read this, keep in mind Jonathan's relationship. Jonathan's the crown prince, right? He's the heir apparent. Even though the kingdom is going to be taken from Saul, it hasn't at this point. Jonathan's on deck, so to speak. He's one heartbeat away from being king. And the natural inclination for Jonathan, so we're reading that his heart was knit, right? But the natural human inclination for Jonathan would be, hey, this thing that's going on with David, this is problematic for me, right? Like, this is going to affect my wallet. And so put that in perspective of our own lives. How many times in a work environment have we heard about this new rising employee or this new rising star, and things we hear, that person's smart, man, they're really good. I'm telling you, they're going places. And if you're in a higher level of employment and you start hearing that, like, you're getting the sense somebody's on my coattails, right? Our natural reaction is, oh, this is really going to be good for the company. But we don't see Jonathan having that reaction, right? Human part of him probably could have had that very easily. Because David, this rising star, was problematic. In fact, we see the exact opposite with Jonathan. It says he admired David. As soon as that conversation was over, their souls were knit. And David standing there, put this in perspective. David, we're told, standing there with Goliath's head in his hand. Like, that had to be an awkward job interview or whatever, right? He's standing there, he's still got the head in his hand. He's been carrying it around this whole time. But that probably would have fired Jonathan up if we think back to the other things that we've learned and read, right? How do we know that? Think back to chapter 14, verse 6 of Jonathan's bravery. Jonathan snuck out of the camp with only his armor bearer, his servant. Everybody else, again, laying low, not doing anything. He tells his armor bearer, come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. We're going to put that on a shelf and hopefully get back to that. But let us go to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or few. So that was Jonathan, referencing the Philistines as uncircumcised. Here's David standing there with Goliath's head in his hand during this conversation. And we compare that to what we read last week with chapter 17 in Tom, when David first learned about Goliath. It says, he said, for who is this uncircumcised Philistine? So there's that reference to the people in opposition of God. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And then further in the 17, David's response, right, is still more than 1,000 years later. David's response still gets our bloods like fired up as Christians. Paraphrasing it, David says, hey, Goliath, you're a big dude, and you got a lot of equipment, right? But I come to you in the name of the Lord of the hosts. And David tells him, I want to kill you, and this is how I'm going to do it, and this is what I'm going to do with your body. It's like some kind of wrestling match, right? From what we used to watch on TV. I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do to you. That's how I see David at that point. And that probably appealed to Jonathan. And then ending in 47, David says, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with a sword and spear, for the battles of Lord's. Jonathan and David, they both understood it's not about personal accomplishments. It's about the sovereignty of God and his glorification. And they both look to the Lord to seek to glorify him. So that's probably what's going on in this conversation, right? We just get, hey, they found out who his dad was and they were knit. But there was more to that. But we have to look back to other verses to figure that out. John and David understood, again, it's not their personal accomplishments. There had to be some type of military admiration on Jonathan's part about David, but it was more than that, right? Because there was a level of affection. We're told that the soul was knit. This is a type of joining by God, right? And it says Jonathan loved David as himself. The relationship was about God. It was their love for God, and that relationship was established by God. Further on into 3 and 4, we see Jonathan makes a covenant, meaning he had a loyalty and a devotion that he pledged to David. He gives David his robe, his armor, his sword, his bow, his belt. And that was significant. That's more than two buddies admiring each other. I'm looking at Steve, and Steve's shooting a Mossberg shotgun. I'm like, I know Steve's, but I know Steve really likes a Benelli shotgun. And that's what the state police used. And I happened to buy one, and I don't ever use it. So Steve, I'm going to give you my Benelli shotgun, right? It's more than that type of relationship here. This is significant. It's not David Jonathan looking at David and going, man, his clothes are kind of ratty. I'm going to give him. It's not what's going on here.
It's really interesting when you look at it and you make a comparison. You have to remember that Jonathan was at least 10 years older than David and could have been as much as 30 years older than David when you look at the timing of all of that. And so you look at him and he's recognizing David for who God says David is at this point in time. And that's really significant because that means he was in tune with God's will at that same point in time.
So what it's signifying is a transfer of David's ability to ascend the throne. That's what's going on here. It's more than just that transformation of material goods. It's Jonathan saying, I'm not going to do this because God wants him to do this. And I am aligned with God, and I am aligned with him. And that's the covenant relationship. Chapter 15 alluded to it, and here it is. It's being fulfilled, right? The heir apparent places the royal garment on the one chosen by God. And while this is going on, Saul is still trying to hold on to that kingdom against God's will, while Jonathan here is surrendering to God's will. And if there's any doubt that this is some type of abdication, it's going to be cleared up in a few more weeks, because in chapter 23, Jonathan is going to tell David, you'll be king over Israel, and I shall be next to you. So that's the Paul Harvey version of more evidence as to what's going on here. But for now, all we have is this symbolism, this exchange of garments. If we move on into verse 5, we're told David becomes more and more successful. Everywhere he goes, good things happen. Saul promotes him in the army. The troops and officers are all pleased. I mean, this is going apparently very well for David. If Saul was the type of person that could realize he could get credit for all this success if he was giving it to God, he would have been in line with these good things. But Saul's not that person. Saul can't let anybody have any other credit but him, right? Verse 6 is talking about they're coming home from Goliath being killed. And if real quick, it happened as they were coming when David returned from striking down the Philistine, and the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with gladness, with musical instruments. And the women sang as they were merry and said, Saul has struck his thousands and David his 10,000s. And we read on that upset Saul. So understand this was probably a drawn out event. It didn't happen bam, bam, bam chronologically. This was probably more like some type of campaign. We know Goliath was slain. We know they chased after them, but there's probably continued on. And as they're coming back, this happened.
We have to remember that in 1805, or right at this time, David's about 16. And he's being set over all of the troops at that point in time at 16. And generally, they didn't make them a commander until they were at least 20. And he set him over all of the men of war at age 16. And so what time transpires in the next 3 or 4 verses,
We don't know.
We just don't know.
But they're singing this song as they come back from this campaign. And this song is popular, man. It's on all the charts, right? I'm looking around like everybody's heard at some point Casey Kasem in his top whatever, right? This is on Casey's top whatever. But everybody loves it. It's that whole Baby Shark thing a few years back, right? But I hated that song. That's what it was in Saul's ears, right? Everybody's singing this song. It's popular, and Saul can't stand it. And we have to pay attention to that. When I say we have to pay attention, again, I mean I have to pay attention to it, right? Because if we look at that, it says they were coming back, and the women singing and dancing went out to meet King Saul. Well, obviously, They didn't come out to meet David. They came out to meet King Saul, but Saul didn't see it that way, right? And then it says, when they sang the song, Saul has struck his 1,000. Saul's the first person that's in the song. So they came to see Saul. The song is about Saul, but what's Saul stuck on? He's stuck on this other little verse out here that's got David's name in it, and the numbers are off. And boom, in verse 8, Saul is angry, right? He didn't like the allocation of the numbers. And what we often skip over, Saul became very angry for this, saying it was displeasing in his eyes, and he said, they have ascribed, skip through, they gave David 10,000 and me, right? But look at the very last part of verse 8. Now, what more can he have but the kingdom? That's the key right there. It's not about the numbers. It's not about, well, they did talk about me first, and they came out to see me. It's about the kingdom. And he, like he said at the beginning, he's paying attention. Whose boy are you? Right? And now he lets it slip. It's about the kingdom. And we're told in verse 10 he keeps an eye on him. In verse 10 he throws a spear at him, right? The spirit that came upon him. Saul was evil. A spirit came from God. The spirit came forcibly. And that spirit managed, if you look there in 10, what Saul was doing. Now it happened on the next day, the evil spirit came. Saul, and he raved in the midst of the house, right? Saul went from prophesying to murder in the blink of an eye because of that spirit. The application is the nature of jealousy is destructive. Jealousy is much like a cancer, right? It creates absolute chaos everywhere it's allowed to grow. In my opinion, if jealousy was a plant, it would be kudzu, all right? It's uncontrollable. And it devours everything it comes in contact with, and that's what jealousy does, right? Later on, Solomon is going to tell us in Proverbs 27, wrath is cruel, anger is overwhelming, but who can stand before jealousy? Which would indicate jealousy is crushing. We can't even stand in front of it. And then much later in the New Testament, James 3 says, bitter jealousy is not from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder in every vile practice. That last part, that's Saul. That's Saul right there. Jealousy, jealous, selfish ambition. And where that is, there will be disorder. There was a lot of disorder in the kingdom at that point, or I shouldn't say in the palace at that point. And every vile practice. And we're gonna see some vile practice here in a minute. And then verse 12 shows us the outcome of this. Saul was afraid of David. He knew the Spirit of God had left him, and now that it rested upon David. So what does he end up doing? He ends up moving David. He kicks him out, so to speak, of the palace. But he can't kick him out, right? Because he needs to be liked. If he kicks him out like a bum, the people are going to turn on him because everybody loves him. So he resorts to this kind of trickery that we see as part of his character, right? This deception, which is really lying, which is sin. So we see Saul's heart. He removes him, but he does it in the form of a promotion. He makes him commander of 1,000. Oh, by the way, to be a commander of 1,000, you're out of the palace and you're on the road. And oh, by the way, that's really dangerous, right? But it's under the guise of, man, David is such a good dude, I'm going to promote him. And that even backfires. In 14, it gets him out of Saul's sight, but shocker, he's a great commander. He's really good at it. And it says all of his undertakings were successful. Not because of who David was, because of who David's God was, because of who David served. David served Yahweh. Saul served self. All of his undertakings were successful. And then verse 15, Saul saw this and he was in fearful awe. So depending on the translation you're reading, it uses fearful awe, but it says, starts off with awe, and then fearful awe. And everyone in Israel and Judah loved him. All his victories, again, victories not by his hand, but they were all God's blessing. They caused the people to love him And at the same time, they caused Saul to hate him. Cause and effect. Saul always fought for Saul. David always fought for God. And because David fought for God, the people were blessed. And all of this foreshadows the one true king who has and will go into battle with the ultimate victory. The application for us is, do we, and you hear this from Pastor Mark frequently in the pulpit, do we truly love our king? Are we like Jonathan? Are we able to abdicate self on our throne? And do we allow God to reign on the throne of our heart? Or are we like Saul? It's my kingdom. My will be done. I can play everything else. I can appear to do the right things, but in that one place that only I know about and God knows about, this is my seat. Are we that type of person? So as we go on, we just have to I want to keep in the back of our minds what we read in 9, where Saul eyed David from that day on, as well as the fear had in verse 12, and then the fearful awe that he had in 15. If we could pick that back up at 17, then Saul said to David, "Here is my older daughter Merab, and I will give her to you as a wife. Only be a man of valor for me and fight Yahweh's battles." For Saul thought, "My hand shall not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistine be against him." But David said to Saul, "Who am I, and what is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be the king's son-in-law?" So it happened at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel, the Metholanite's wife, as a wife. And Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. So they told Saul, and the thing was right in his eyes. And Saul said, "I will give her to him, and that she may become a snare to him, that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." Therefore Saul said to David, "For a second time you may be my son-in-law." Then Saul commanded his servants, "Speak to David secretly, saying, Behold, the king delights in you, and all his servants love you. So now become the king's son-in-law." So Saul's servant spoke these words in David's hearing, but David said, "Is it trivial in your eyes to become the king's son-in-law, since I'm a poor man and lightly esteemed?" And the servants of Saul told him according to these words which David spoke. Saul then said, "Thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry except 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemy." Now Saul planned to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. Then his servants told David these words, and it was right in the eyes of David to become the king's son-in-law. So before the days had expired, David rose up and went, he and his men, and struck down 200 men among the Philistines. Then David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full number to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. So Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, as a wife. Then Saul saw and knew that Yahweh was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. So Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continually. Then the commanders of the Philistines went out to battle, and it happened as often as they went out that David behaved himself more insightfully than all the servants of Saul. So his name was highly esteemed. I read this, and it reminded me of a little bit of high school. Hey, do you know such and such? Yeah, I know him. Will you find out if he likes me? All right, I'll find out if he likes you. Hey, man, do you like such and such? No, I don't like her. I like such and such. Back and forth, and no direct personal communication. Right? It's hard to follow it. But everything that Saul does just doesn't work out, right? Because the Spirit of God has left him. And everything that Saul says and everything that he thinks are total opposites. Like, he says one thing, but he thinks something else. He has a problem with consistency. And at the core of Saul, there's an inadequacy, and that inadequacy results in insecurity. And that security produces fear. And that fear leads to jealousy. And that jealousy leads to anger. And as we say today, man, he's a hot mess. Right? And it's all because the center of Saul's heart is Saul. And he never measures up. And that's what's fueling this. He never allows God on his heart. And he is on his heart, and he will never measure up. and neither will we if we find ourselves in that condition. But at this point, he wants to give his oldest daughter to David as a wife. But if we look back and if we can think back, right, there was supposed to be this prize for the slaying of Goliath to some degree. Apparently it never took place. And now Saul's willing to do it with a stipulation. He says he's going to do this, but only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battle. And verse 17 is a deep insight to Saul, his heart, and how it's just layered with sin, right? If you look at it in its entirety, Saul hasn't lived up to the pledge of his daughter's hand being given till now. He wants David dead, but he won't risk going out and killing him outright or having him killed outright, which he could do because he's the king, right? He has to come up with these plots and way to do it so he's not connected. He wants and craves the affection of the people. He has to make the death look like an accident. He decides now he's going to use his daughter as bait, and he's going to connect her hand. He connects her hand with the Lord's battles. But he's using his daughter as a pawn, not only to have David get killed in this action, but he's also saying, and fight the Lord's battles for me. Right? And he connects himself in here with the work of the Lord, and he's never done that. He's always messed that up. He's always in the back. He's always rushing the gun or not letting the people eat. So Alistair Begg, when he's commenting on this, says, when one starts to tell lies, one begins to exhibit certain levels of behavior of deception predicated on boisterous claims. And a few people in here, Larry, the sheriff, can attest to that. We're taught that in law enforcement, right? We're taught the same thing. When they're teaching law enforcement how to investigate crimes, they tell us always to look for somebody calling down a higher power or masking what they're trying to do. And we often hear things. So if Pastor Cal said, Alan, did you rip the door handle off the back of the church? I'd say, I did the first time, not the second. And Pastor Cal said, Alan, did you rip the door off the back of the church the second time? I said, Pastor Cal, I didn't do it. But if I say, I swear on my mom's grave, Pastor Cal, right? Pastor Cal knows, he probably did. Like, he can't prove it because the cameras might not have picked it up. Or if I say, Pastor Cal, God is my witness, which I wouldn't say, but when people start to do that, that's a sign of deception, and that's what Saul's doing here when he's throwing in these little tidbits of, and do God's work. It has nothing to do with God's work. And Saul was the one that did nothing for 40 days, and we contrast that with David. So if you think about that, David showed up, he dropped off the stuff he was supposed to do, he ran down and talked to his brothers, he hears what's going on, he refused the armor, he picked up some stones, he called Goliath out and killed him. And Saul is weaving this plot, and he's trying to appeal to David's affection, he's trying to appeal to David's loyalty to God, he's faking care and love and concern for the kingdom, and he's also smart enough to tie it in with a manly desire to have a bride. So we have to think, everything that we think of in 18, it's all tied to these details of other chapters, right? The idea of marrying the king's daughter had already been put out there. Apparently that didn't take place. But now Saul is going to tie it to potentially hurting his daughter, where before it wouldn't have hurt his daughter. You understand? If a bunch of dudes go kill Goliath or try to kill Goliath so they can get the daughter, well, the daughter doesn't necessarily know who they are. What does she care if they come back or not, or get killed or not? But now there's this arranged marriage, and by the way, this arranged marriage is probably going to end in a funeral, and you're going to be a widow. If Saul's plan goes right. And he's risked hurting his own daughter to accomplish a selfish end, right? And he's hiding his motive. At some point, Saul is at a point where he wants to use the enemies of God to take down the man God has chosen. And it's obvious whose side Saul is on. In 18 through 19, we see the humility of David. He says, who am I to deserve the king's daughter? And for some reason, we find out Merab is given to another. We're not told why, but we know that plan failed. But what we also tend to miss there is that's an opportunity for God's mercy, right? Because that plan failed. Saul could have been like, man, what was I thinking? And he could have fallen before God in repentance. He could have gone to David in repentance, but he didn't do it. He's never done that. If he's done that, it's always been in fake, right? And the application there, sometimes we miss the hand of God in our failures. Difficulty, sadness at times blind us to the fact that God is still at work in our lives, even when things don't go according to our perspective. Saul saw it as a failure. It could have been an exit ramp to a truck running out of control. And we don't know the lapse of time, but in verse 20, Saul's daughter, Michal, loved David, and all of a sudden Saul's going to double down. Here we go. I got it. This didn't work, but this one will work. And that, again, just shows his lack of concern and love for his family, because now he's willing to hurt the other daughter. He seizes that opportunity. He's probably thinking, I can make this work, right? Same plan, disguises it the same way. Same type of fake civility. You shall be my son-in-law. And he backs it up with all these servants saying, oh man, the king really likes you. There's a lot of drama, right? Servants say the king delights in you. David has this thing. He says, I'm a poor dude. What is it to me? I'm poor. I have no reputation. And Saul's like, you know what, man? There's no money involved. We're just gonna give you, you give me 100 foreskins. Which back then, that desecration of the enemy's body was something they do. We see that later in time with Native Americans in the West, where they would scout people. Saul says there's no money, but there's foreskins involved. Look how detailed this plot becomes, right? He could have said, hey, you know what? You're such a good dude. I'm lucky to have you in my family. Take my wife. I'll take my daughter as your wife. You killed Goliath, but he didn't do it. But when he threw that foreskin thing out there, you have to understand that probably appealed to David, because what did David and Jonathan reference the Philistines? Uncircumcised. So he's appealing to that manly part of David. He's like, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to get me some, and I'm going to bring them back. I'm going to kill them. I'm going to get to kill a bunch of them, 100 versus 1, and I'm going to show him. And David, that appeals to David. How do we know that? Because he went and brought 200 back. And this is the same, again, as Tom brought it out. This same conflict as Genesis 3. Saul is trying to bring down the one through whom the Messiah will come. And Saul's appealing to David's wallet, his pride, his character, his manly desires. David comes back with the 200. If I could see this in my mind, Saul's out there doing something, and he's like, yep, David's probably getting it killed right about now. And then the servants say, hey, David's on his way. He's like, what? Yeah, he's on his way back. He killed him. And then he shows him 200, and it had to set Saul into orbit, right?
That's a good example of where Jesus says if someone makes you walk a mile, go 2.
Right? Yeah. In 28, then Saul saw and knew that Yahweh was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. So Saul was even more afraid of David, and Saul was David's enemy continually. And that tells you how it ends up, right? He's even more afraid than he was before. This fear consumed Saul. Basically, Saul had what I call David derangement syndrome before Trump derangement syndrome, way back in the day. Like if you said the name David, I'm sure Saul's head spun around. And as we look in 30, it's kind of the lens drawing back in 30. It's a slow fade. The Philistines, they come and go, right? Heathens are going to heathe. There's going to be battles. And David has more success. He just goes out and he has more success and more success. Why? Because the Lord is with him. The Lord is on his heart. And his reputation continues to grow. Despite every one of Saul's schemes, David's stock continues to rise because he is highly esteemed. Because God is on his heart. He has taken himself off his heart and place God upon it. And we have to ask, what about us? So next week, Elder Brian's going to take us into 19, which again is that famous one of the arrows where Saul is going to actually come out. And so all this has been disguised Saul's plots. In 19, Saul's just going to lay it out here. I want him dead. And so as I said, this is a continuation of two kingdoms colliding. And we have to ask ourselves, what about the kingdoms in our heart? Is it the kingdom of man or the kingdom of God in our hearts? Anybody have anything? Yeah. couldn't help but think exactly that when I was reading this, and I was thinking about the Proverbs part, and I was like, oh, you know, Solomon, and when he wrote that, was he thinking back to all of that? Was he thinking back to, this is what this dude tried to do to my son, my dad, and then this is what my dad did. And man, from Solomon's perspective and his wisdom, I can see in hindsight how terrible jealousy is, because I saw it in my own family. Potentially, we don't know that for sure. That's good. Tom, would you close this, please?